Okay, hello again. Finally, this is your video for the first part of Oscar Hijuelos, the Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love. I'm going to make this video focus mostly on an introduction to Hijuelos and the Mambo Kings, as well as a little bit of Cuban knowledge, history, that will help you understand the world in which Hijuelos is putting these characters. Next week we'll have a video covering the second half of the book. For this week you're going to want to read about halfway through before you do your reading response that's due Friday, and then next week you'll finish the novel and do a second reading response unless the syllabus says not to. I forget exactly without looking. Just follow the directions on the syllabus. So hopefully you've already started reading. You're understanding that Hijuelos is writing this novel from the standpoint of memory, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but let me first tell you a little bit more about this man, Oscar Hijuelos, born in 1951, died in 2013. Not born in Cuba, born here in the United States, but his parents were Cuban immigrants. And he was educated in and around New York City, very well adapted to writing at the beginning of his life, wrote short stories and tried his hand at some creative pieces before eventually doing some writing for his career in advertising and in other places, and then ultimately writing for a profession. He died, as I said, in 2013. He was only 62 years old. He died of a heart attack. He spent most of his life growing up in New York City area around other Cuban immigrants. His parents had both immigrated to Cuba or from Cuba and found work here in the United States, doing odd jobs and fairly different things over his lifespan. When he was young, he went to Cuba on a trip and contracted an illness that put him in the hospital for a long time. And it was during this time, it's been sort of well documented, and in the interview that I have attached here that you can watch, he mentions this as a time where after being in the hospital, he loses connection with his Spanish language sort of aptitude. He becomes sort of distanced from that, and it's a certain way of metaphorically also representing that this is a break in his identity, but it's an actuality as well. He became estranged from his Spanish language and from his cultural roots in a lot of ways. When he published this book, The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love, this was his second novel. He published it in 1989, and it was very well received by both popular audiences and critics as well. And it won the 1990 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and he became the first Latino man to win this prize. So it's monumental, but also indicates that this is only just a few decades ago when this happened. So it seems like a testament to Latino writers in the United States, but also something that says for a long time up to then they were being not recognized. The novel, of course, is probably secondary to what is more famous is the film adaptation, the 1992 film, just simply called The Mambo Kings, which had Antonio Banderas and Armand Assante in the two brothers' roles, and was probably more well-known than the book. In fact, when the movie came out, I think it was one of those cases where people would say, oh, there's a book to this as well. The theme, of course, and so far you've probably picked up on this if you've already started reading, is about the Cuban immigrant experience to America during the first part of the 20th century. And we're going to expand on this, of course, because this is the theme of our course, but The other sort of underlying theme here is focusing on this big, huge cultural explosion that culminates in the 1950s in particular of the Cuban influence on American jazz music of the time that results in Mambo and other sort of related types of music that express a merger between jazz and Cuban traditions in this way that's very, very American, and as I said already, exploded particularly in the 1950s. And Hijuelos uses this cultural touchstone along with real-life musicians from the time like Mongo Santamaria and Tito Puente and others sprinkled throughout the novel to set his two brothers, Cesar and Nestor, as examples of immigrants from Cuba who come into the United States and find a niche for themselves. They're very, very talented, of course, but because of this sort of American landscape that promotes and consumes on such a high level, their art is part of a pop cultural explosion, but it's also part of a capitalist commodification that might be both successful but also a little bit of a taking advantage of these particular characters. So Cesar is telling this story from the present, looking back, remembering the glory days and the days building up through their early career and their talents and their obstacles that they must overcome and their lovers and all of these different incidents. And it's all sort of highlighted by this one particular moment of cultural glory when they appear on the I Love Lucy show alongside another Cuban immigrant, Ricky Ricardo, played by Desi Arnaz, who is an actual Cuban immigrant who was exploited, if you will, by playing up his thick accent and his antics in a way that he becomes almost a caricature of Cuban music of the time. And Americans, of course, loved the I Love Lucy show, very popular. And for the Mambo Kings, the brothers in this novel, to have appeared on that show, is treated early on as the pinnacle of their success. And it's played again and again and again as a moment of glory for them looking back. But Hijuelos also underpins that with a moment of sadness. They're being sort of reduced to pictures of culture rather than authentic images of culture. And this is the sort of circle that he keeps playing with. This is a huge moment of immigrant success, coming in and blending cultures and producing something glorious and new and that takes the world by storm. But in some ways it might also be the existent cultural machine taking advantage of newcomers. And that conversation goes back and forth. And of course, in the arena of our class, this is something that happens throughout the world and throughout many different cultural interplays. There are dominant cultures that sort of absorb, usurp, and maybe sort of reproduce in pop cultural mass appeal ways cultural artifacts that used to have authenticity, but then after have sort of a gleaming sense of commercialism to them. Okay. Now, of course, the music from this time is beautiful and it's well crafted and it's artistic and it's very much a celebration of cultures coming together. But also, we can't ignore that perhaps this is really at its root maybe only a token nod to immigrants bringing wonderful art, but we don't necessarily welcome immigrants en masse. It's another way of seeing a very simplistic way. Look at all the fast food Mexican restaurants throughout the United States, Taco Bells and whatnot, which are of course misadaptations of real, authentic cuisine from these countries, but yet we love these types of food on huge, massive pop cultural levels, right? And it's no sort of ethnic experience to go to Taco Bell and eat a taco because everybody does it. Well, not everybody, because their food is not wonderful. But you know what I'm saying in terms of the mass appeal of quote-unquote Mexican food, just for an example. I want to talk a little bit more about the novel when it came out. As I said, it came out in 1989, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1990, and it continues Hijuelos' ongoing question, that he writes about in other places, that has to do with the way that immigrants, and he's talking about Cuban immigrants in general here, adjust to their newfound home, the United States in this case, and how they see themselves in relation to their new culture in contrast to the culture of where they come from. Okay? And this is part of what Cesar is doing as he's drudging up these memories from his hotel room. And he's going over, the times from his past, the good times, the bad times, all of these things in relation to his Cuban ancestry and the way that Cuban culture looks in the United States compared to how it looked back in Cuba. Okay, so behind all of this is this idea of Cubans' particular history. And of course, in the 20th century, the most prominent event in Cuban history, particularly as it relates to the United States, but as it relates to the entire world as well, is the revolution inspired and led by Fidel Castro in 1959. So Hijuelos is writing about the time before this, looking through that lens, and Cesar is sitting in a time in the future beyond that lens, looking back as well. So they're both doing the same thing. We know as readers, of course, that there's this huge moment coming after all this sort of glorious cultural merging and relations between the United States and Cuba. We know that there's this moment coming that's going to change that relationship and that identity that Cuban immigrants have based on this one sort of dividing line in the 20th century version of their immigration story. And many other literature productions about Cuba from the 20th century in particular will look at this moment, some more prominently than other, but we'll look at this moment as a dividing line, dividing families, dividing, sort of cultural loyalties, etc. And what's undeniable in all of them is that this moment changes the way that immigrants in the United States from Cuba, as well as Cubans who remain at home, it changes the way that they are identified by themselves and by others. And what happens during this time is that Castro, of course, nationalizes everything after the revolution, and he changes policies as to migrants leaving, emigrants with an E, and the United States, of course, reacts in tow in terms of establishing their policy with Cuba afterwards. Prior to this, the United States and Cuban relationship was one that came about after the Spanish-American War that ended right at the end of the 19th century and resulted in Spain leaving the Western Hemisphere, leaving Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other places as well. And Puerto Rico, of course, becomes a commonwealth under the United States protection. And Cuba has with it also this very unique identity as a sovereign nation, but with a very prominent hand of the United States sort of guarding them economically and culturally and keeping a very, very good relationship with the government in Cuba after the Spanish rule had been kicked out. And so the first part of the 20th century, the relationship between the United States and Cuba is driven by economy. And I don't mean that in a sense where trade is fair and there's a back and forth, but largely the Cuban government recognizes the United States dominance, and the relationship is largely driven by the United States seeing Cuba as beneficial to them in terms of their resources and their location, and the Cuban government, many different outcomes of this are expressed in the way that Cuba is a home for United States vacations and for offshore accounts and for spreading the United States economic philosophy, etc. And this is all sort of, how do I want to say, co-opted by a man by the name of Fulgencio Batista, who becomes Cuba's leader during this time, and to whom Fidel Castro and other socialist-minded revolutionaries target their insurrection. And so the phrase, you've heard this probably many times, Cuba Libre, or Free Cuba, which had been tossed about in the 19th century by people like José Martí, who wanted the Spanish monarchy out of Cuba, is resurrected in the 20th century as a way that wants to throw out Batista and other sort of neo-colonialist forces, mostly the United States, that oppress the Cuban people in a way that they don't fulfill their ultimate identity. And so this is the impetus for Castro's revolution. Now the people at large respond differently to the relations during this time. And Cesar and Nestor, who are immigrants prior to this, feel very tied to their Cuban homeland and to their ancestry and traditions that Cuba has given them, but also feel pulled to the United States because of the opportunities there. And they're talented musicians, of course, but they're also wanting to sort of make names for themselves. And this king-like identity, the Mambo Kings, is played with early on and throughout the novel as this way of conquering and ruling and being treated like royalty in some ways. And when this, and I'm not going to talk too far because some of this happens in the second half of the novel, when you look back through this lens, you see that this way of life kind of disappears for Cubans who remain in the country after the Cuban Revolution, and there's a falling action, a sadness to that particular narrative in parts of the book that Hijuelos is getting to. Okay, I think we'll stop with that for now. I will come back with a video next week that's going to look more specifically at some of the happenings in the book. Again, follow the syllabus for whether or not you need to do a reading response for this week. I'm going to put up some references to some of this Cuban history that I shorthanded for you here, so you can learn a little bit more about the Spanish-American War and then the rise of the Batista dictatorship at the first part of the 20th century. Check those out. There's also a video interview up there with Hijuelos talking a little bit more about his life and this book and Cuban culture in general. Check those things out. Email me if you have any questions, and I'll see you on the next video.